Welcome, friends. Thanks for joining another All Hands on Tech with me, your host, David Neal. We are working on a Node.js application that is uses some technologies like Fastify and Socket.io, and we'll later on down the road we'll use some things like maybe Vue and Tailwind. Haven't decided completely on that, but we'll cross that bridge when we get there. And we're building a multiplayer trivia game, real time. So we're using sockets to communicate between each of the clients and the server, and we're going to make this much like a game you may have played online with friends and or family. And we'll see. It's not maybe as simple as it may seem, dealing with all the different states and things to manage a game. It's a fun problem to solve, and it's something I think we can learn from and apply it to other types of projects. When we really think about, well, at this point in the workflow or the process, it needs to be in this state. So we're, you know, uh, maybe some ideas borrowed from state machines and state management. We'll see how it goes. We got started last Thursday, a brand new project, and we got Fastify set up and a few other things installed. Got Socket.io installed in the project, but that's about as far as we got. We got a little stuck, or I got stuck on getting Socket.io set up with Fastify. So Express, as I talked about last week, Express is everywhere. It's kind of like the standard for building Node.js applications, right? There's It's just so ubiquitous when it comes to you know examples in code and tutorials. Express is kind of universal, but there are some really great frameworks that have come out since Express that have some really compelling features and have some more modern takes on building Node.js based applications. And so I talked about that last week with using Fastify. It borrows some ideas from Express, borrows some ideas from another framework called Happy, which came out of Walmart Labs, and I'm a big fan of Happy. So I'm pretty excited about learning Fastify, and that's part of the friction, right? Is that I'm learning this the same time I'm trying to bring you along with me on this journey. So I know I'm going to run into things that I haven't seen before, which is exactly what happened last week. But that's part of the experiment. Is I'm learning in the open, and I'm demonstrating to you that, hey, we're all new to things at some point. We're all on a journey, and no matter how long you've been coding, I've been coding for quite a while. There's always new things that come out, and there's always this journey that we're on to learn things new. Talk a little bit about maybe imposter syndrome. Like, am I really a good developer? Because I struggle so much with learning, adopting new technologies. And the answer is, I'm as good a developer as anyone. You're as good a developer as anyone, because we all struggle with learning new things and new frameworks, and it has more to do with the examples and things we can find to help learn that new technology and apply it. Um, Sometimes this bleeding edge technology that we want to try and use, there's just not a lot of documentation or things that are available to help us. And so, yeah, there's going to be some struggle. There's going to be some flailing around a bit as we try to figure things out. Before I forget, if you want to follow along, one of the things that I did at the end of last week's stream is I committed everything to a repository. So if you want to get the code and you want to follow along or play around with it yourself, and maybe even take it in a different direction, or you want to add some new features and submit that as a pull request, we can certainly go over pull requests during these live streams as well. But the source code is available at github.com/reverentgeek/AHOT-trivia-game. AHOT trivia game. So AHOT stands for All Hands on Tech. So that's this show, All Hands on Tech. AHOT trivia game. We may want to come up with some more clever stuff at some point. But go grab the source code if you want to, and let's dive in. If you do have any questions or comments, please post them in the chat. I'd love to hear from you. I'd love to hear your feedback. If you are wondering what in the world I'm doing or have any suggestions on to help steer me in the right direction, please post those in the chat. Albert says hello. Hello, Albert. Glad that you're here. I'm going to switch over to my other screen, and I'm going to hide this caption so you can see everything. If at any point you want me to put the link back for the Git repository, just say so in the comments and I'll stick it back up there. So last week we got as far as standing up a Fastify server, and we were in the process of creating, basically a hello world application and getting trying to wire in Socket.io. So I was a little perplexed at the end of the stream, like I kind of had an idea of why it wasn't working, but I did a little research, did some homework between last week and this week, and I think I have at least a better foundation or starting point to get us to the next step. So we've got our server and the Fastify.io plugin. We're using a plugin called Fastify Static to be able to send static files to the browser, such as HTML, CSS, JavaScript, whatever assets we may want to send from the server, not just JSON data, but all the other kinds of things for building a web application. And we're using the path, which is a built-in library in Node.js, to resolve some things like the folder for where our public stuff resides. We've got we're registering the socket plugin, registering the static file plugin, and then we've got where our routes are defined. We just have one route right now. That is the default route. We're about to refactor a lot of this stuff. We've got a ready event. So when Fastify is done initializing, we want to use that opportunity to initialize our WebSocket stuff, like any kind of channels that we want to set up for listening for messages back and forth between the server and the client. And then finally, we've got a start function that starts the server and gets going. So some of the other things that real quickly that we did last week is in the package.json file, we set up NodeMon, which is a nice little development environment for Node.js. It runs the application and looks for any changes that you make to JavaScript files or any kind of source code, and it automatically restarts the server so that we don't have to be in this constantly stopping and restarting the server ourselves. We installed ESLint and my settings for ESLint so that we can get some better JavaScript syntax. We get alerted of any kind of syntax errors, and also helps keep the code looking consistent. All right. So let's start with how we're registering the all these plugins, and I'm going to start off by doing a little bit of refactoring. I want to it seems my computer is frozen. I hope not. Back again. Don't know if you saw that or not, but my computer was kind of froze up there for a minute. Hopefully that doesn't persist or get worse. Grab your favorite beverage as we dig in. I've got a good amount of coffee here. All right. So part of the issue that I had last week is that I really need to, whenever a request comes in, I need to send HTML to the client and not just send like a JSON object or something like that. And so I was going about this a little bit the wrong way. So instead of returning this stuff or doing any of this work, let's comment that out for now. I found out through my homework that this Fastify static allows us to use a shortcut called reply.send file, I believe. So if we do send file, let's see, what did we call? Under public here, we got index.html. So index.html. And this index.html just has hey y'all in it. So let's see if my memory serves correctly. So npm run dev, and let me get my browser window. Over here, localhost 3000. Nope, that didn't work. Let's see what the console says. The console says reply was already sent. So maybe a return reply.send. And as you can see, when I save those changes, NodeMon restarts the server, so I don't have to to do that manually. It's awesome. Okay. So there we go. We got the HTML file returned as we would hope. And we need, in order for Socket.io to work properly, it needs to have the Socket.io client running in the browser. So we need to add some JavaScript to this HTML file to initialize the Socket.io client in the browser. The cool thing is, when we register this Fastify IO plugin, is it adds the Fastify client and other endpoints, makes those available to be called. It automatically sets up a route inside the web server to respond to certain endpoints. So let's first of all bring in the Socket.io. I believe it's Socket.io. I need to refer to my Socket.io.js. And then we'll add some additional JavaScript, say var or const io socket equals io. And let's also, when we receive a message on channel hello, let's log that message just to see that we're receiving messages from the server. So now if we come over here and we refresh the browser, what I hope to see is that we're connected, and we're not. So it's saying here in the log messages that the URL socketio.js is not found. And I told you I did some homework since last week, and what I found was I almost, like, I couldn't get it to work. And I was thinking, man, I'm going to have to abandon using Fastify and go back to using Express. But the interesting thing is, there was red herrings, as you may call them, where I went down the path of like trying to figure out what was wrong with the plugin. that journey you may go on sometimes is like, well, why isn't this working? And the next phase is, how did this ever work? And that was me. I was looking at the Fastify Socket.io plugin and seeing what it does, and I'm like, how did this ever work in the first place? And then that led me to looking at the source code for Socket.io and how it registers things. And I finally figured out that something isn't right with Fastify. And it may be just a Mac OS thing, I don't know. But what I found was let's do this. If I change localhost port 3000 to 127.0.0.1, which is what localhost should be pointing to, and then look at the console, look here, socket connection made. So localhost And 127.0.0.1 is apparently not the same thing on Mac OS, and it might be treated differently on other operating systems too. I don't know. So that's that's the key. When I figured out, based on some other errors or issues that people were running into with Fastify, that led me to actually read some of the documentation on Fastify and discover that naming the host matters. So the examples that we run into on most examples we see just specify the port. But if we specify the host and we either use 127.0.0.1 or no, that's not it. If we specify 0.0.0, which means listen on everything that may be bound to this IP4, we can also do 2 colons, which means, I think, according to the documentation, everything on IP4, everything on IP6. So if we do this and the server automatically restarted, and I come back here and I change this back to localhost 3000, we see that the socket connection is made, which that was almost like like I said, almost a deal breaker for me, because it took me quite a while to figure out that it was the host that was causing localhost in the browser not to work correctly with connecting to those other paths. I don't know. I don't have a good explanation. I just know that I figured out how to make it work. And man, that isn't that the story in technology as software developers so many times? Like, man, this is this is working. I don't know, or this isn't working, and I don't know why. And then you get it working, and I don't know why. But we trust that, hey, this is the way to solve it. Let's move on with our lives and get things going. So also, let's see if I bring up the console, and I did that by using Command Option I. Here's my JavaScript console over here. If I now that I have that working, I'm going to say console log socket .id. So we'll log that as part of it. And then we'll say socket.emit, which is their version of sending a message. I will emit. First parameter is a channel, like what the name of the channel is. And over here, we call the channel hello. So let's make sure we use the same channel name over here. So emit on channel hello, hey client. So now if we come over here, well, I didn't even have to refresh the browser because as soon as the web server restarted and the client reconnected, it sent the message. So that demonstrates that we can send messages from the server to the client, and conversely, we should be able to send messages from the client back to the server. So this is our first step in getting a kind of a real-time game set up, is being able to send messages back and forth without having to refresh the browser, without having to do anything else. It's, a socket connection is open and we can send messages back and forth. All right. Now that we got that working, I want to, and here's our socket ID. I want to do some refactoring because we've got a bunch of stuff that would remove some of the stuff that's been commented out. And you know what? I don't like having stuff like this hard coded in our code. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to move this over. What I'm going to do is kind of the standard for Node.js applications is environment variables. And oftentimes when you deploy a Node.js app to some host,
here's what I found.
You use environment variables to configure the service. And so things like the port and the host and any other kinds of production configuration settings need to be able to read those from the environment and use those values instead of anything that's hard coded in the application. So one of the things that a tool or utility for Node.js that I use a lot and have used for years is called .env. So let me clear the screen here so you can see things a little bit better. I'm going to add as a developer dependency, so it'll be save -dev. You can also do -D. .env. And to use the .env, one is we need a .env file. So let's create that. Now, an environment file is just a like name value pairs. So we'll say port equals 8080, host equals, and use the 2 colons. So it's listening to everything. We could also say 0.0.0. That'll work too. But a .environment file is not something that you typically check in to your source code repository. That's because your environment file may be specific to your machine, and someone else may want to use different settings. You use a different port, use a different host name. Sometimes your environment file may contain secrets, like what what your credentials are for connecting to some API, like an API key, right? And you don't want to check that into the repository because you don't want everybody to be able to see that. Oh, by the way, one of the reasons why we're using .env and not just creating environment variables for the application to use is because that becomes really difficult to maintain. And especially on some operating systems like Windows, it's really hard to set global environment variables. At least the last time I knew it was still very hard. So this configuration file will definitely help. So back to not wanting to check this in, right? It's just not a good idea. So what I typically do is before I check in any more code is I'll go to the gitignore file and somewhere in here, instruct Git to ignore any file that named .env. And so now if I check Git status, we see all these other files that have been changed, but .env is not showing up as a new or modified file that needs to be checked in. So that's good. But from a documentation perspective, folks need to know, well, what do I put in a .env file? So you need to describe in the README for the project what goes in a .env. And a lot of times I will also include, again, I'll clear this, I'll include a .env .sample. And let's just take, we don't have any secrets or anything to hide right now. So maybe in the sample, we'd say, well, port 3000 instead of 8080. But in the README, we'd say something like, and we will do this eventually, add instructions on, copy this .env sample file to .env and then modify that file to match your environment. Okay, so we got our environment file and all of that. So now how do we use it? We've got, and that requires requiring in the .env. And honestly, I've done this dozens of times, at least, if not more. I don't remember off the top of my head what the syntax is for a .env. I think it's .env.config, and it just works. But let's double check. I want, this is the same kind of tip that I shared last week. If we do npm docs .env, it will load the README for that project. So .env usage, and you can save it in your bucket, so forth. And so, yeah, .config will read in your environment file and add it to nodes process.environment as if it were, settings set at the operating system level. That just reminded me, I told you incorrectly that we were going to install this as a developer dependency. Actually, we need .env to be able to run in production too, because the way we're going to write this code is that it's got to be there. So let me do this. I'm going to uninstall .env, which will remove it from the package JSON, and then reinstall without the saves-dev npm install .env, and let's double check package JSON. Yep. So it's now listed as a production dependency. And so the example is they did this, require .env.config, and that's valid. That works. But I come from a school of thought that I like to be a little bit more explicit. So And there's other things you may want to do. It's rare, but there's other things you may want to do with the .env. So I'm going to keep it as two separate lines. And so now, after .env.config runs, whatever is in that .env file will be added to process.env and available that way. So we can say here, port, if we use destructuring in JavaScript, we can say port and host equals process.env. And now we can use port and host here. Here's a trick with destructuring, and we can do so. Let me explain what destructuring is doing. It's taking the place of saying const port equals process.env.port. So that's how you normally access an environment variable on process.env. Process is a built-in Node.js variable that has like information about the current Node.js environment. And env is a property on that contains all the environment variables that are set for the operating system that Node is running on. So this destructuring allows us to, take values off of that object. And another thing we can do is rename in the process to port and host lowercase. The environment variables are always uppercase. I hope that makes sense. We're using destructuring to grab the port and the host uppercase out of process.env, and at the same time we're mapping those uppercase to lowercase. So the lowercase becomes our local variables, and then we're passing an object to fastify.listen, which would be our options object. We could say const options equals port and host, and pass that to the listen. Both are valid syntax, and do the exact same thing. If we break it out into a separate line like this, then it's a little bit more explicit, and we may have other options that we want to set, and having it separate may make sense. But either one works. I don't know what syntax you may prefer. Again, if you have any questions or want me to clarify anything, if something I'm doing or talking about doesn't make sense, let me know in the comments. I'd be glad to help clarify anything. So now we got our server running, or we've got our process stuff, environment stuff in place. Let's make sure it's doing what we expect. So what we should see is that our server is now listening on port 8080 instead of 3000. And looky there, server listening at 0.0.0.0 port 8080. And if we open up the browser, There it is. Let's clear the console here. And we refresh. Oh, we're no longer on 3000. Man, I don't know what's going on with the browser. I guess Brave may not be liking this restream stuff. Or something's happening. Localhost 8080. And we get our Hey client. Browsers, first time you hit a new URL, it's going to look for a faveicon.ico to show here in the tab, but we don't have one yet. So we're getting a 404, but everything else is working as we expect. We get the Hey client message, got the Hey y'all. If I come here to index.html and change this to game client, hit refresh, we get a new stuff. All right. Another thing that I want to do in refactoring our code so far is this pub folder that I have. I want to use that as like the container for things like our client JavaScript files, CSS, any kind of images or other assets that we may have for the client. And so it doesn't make sense to have the HTML files in there because we're never going to serve those from that static plugin. We're going to serve those from the routes that we define in the in this index.js. So typically what you find in Node.js applications is, at least on server side rendering of HTML, is you'll have a folder called views, where you may have like your templates or something like that for rendering HTML. So I'm going to create a folder called views and move index.html to this views folder. And that means that I need to update this route to use that new path. So instead of sending a file and expecting it to be in that public path folder, I need to, I'm going to declare another path up here. So we'll say views equals path dot join dir name, which underscore dir name is a built-in Node.js value that is like the folder where this application lives. In this case, it resolves to source. So dir name views, and we'll say send file path.join views index.html. And the reason we're using path.join instead of just typing in like slashes, creating this relative path is different operating systems use different slashes. Like Mac uses / and Windows uses / and there's other weirdness that can come into play, like escaping certain characters and whatnot. So the path library does the work for us of resolving any of those operating system specific differences. So path.join is definitely the better solution, because it may work on your machine and then you go to deploy it for somewhere and things don't work right, and it may not be clear why. All right, we save that. Let's make sure that it's still working. So we refresh. Did not work. So maybe send file does not work like I expected it to. Maybe it only works with things that have been declared with this static file plugin. So let me make sure the path looks correct. So let's say const v equals that, and we'll console log v and see what happens when we try to refresh the page. It's not found. And v trivia game source views index.html. So the path is correct, but it's still not working. So we can register with Fastify. Another instance of this Fastify static plugin, and we'll say the root is our views folder, and the path is /views, and I think there's one other setting we have to declare. I'm going to leave it at that for now and see what the error message is. Then file's already been added. This is the error if you try to register the decorate reply. Maybe that's the setting. No. Let's check the documentation. So Fastify. Plugin. Usage. A different root. Oh, never mind. So, according to this documentation, which I should have, looked at in the first place, we can send an HTML file that's outside of our static folder, but the syntax is to send that path, the folder name, as a second argument to the send file. So instead of registering a views, which we don't really need, we can send file index.html and use our views as that second argument. Okay. Restarted, no longer angry, and our HTML works. Cool. You know, it really helps to read the documentation. We got a few minutes left. If you have any questions about anything that we've covered today or something that was from last week that I kind of may have glossed over, please post those in the comments. While I'm waiting for anyone to comment, I'm going to switch to I'm going to do a little bit more refactoring. So one of the examples that we pulled from requires in Fastify and then creates an instance of the Fastify server in the same line, which is valid. But I personally don't care for that kind of syntax. I like, to have all my libraries required in at the top of the source code file, and then any of the work that needs to be done happening later on. So I'm going to take this, cut that, and come down here after some of these other things are set, and create the Fastify server. And we'll say const server equals Fastify, and call that function. And, right now, everything still expects Fastify, this variable, to be the server, and it no longer is. We need to rename everything to server. So there's a couple of ways we could do that. We could use the built-in function here inside Visual Studio. So if we do, let's see, F2, we can rename it from Fastify to server, and it should update everything everywhere. And the only place we need to fix is this one here. So let's call this one Fastify, and this one is Fastify. And let's see. I think that's everything. Yeah, I think that's everything that I wanted to take care of. So next week, we will definitely be finally getting into some game logic. So now that we have our server and our client, we're going to do some, well, one thing we got 5 minutes left, no questions. So let's do one more step. Let's add it to our public folder, a new JavaScript file. We'll call it client.js. And we'll move this into our client.js file. And the client.js is where we're going to, spend a lot of time adding the client side game logic, and we'll have a server side game logic that manages the game state and so forth. So let's take this code and put it in here. Let's also import IO. Let's see. IO from, that'll be socket IO slash socket IO.js. Well, I do know that since we're using ES module syntax, there is a .esm JS version. And as I talked about last week, we need a separate ESLint js.rc rc.js file here in this public folder, because the JavaScript files that are going to be in this folder are intended for the browser and they're not Node.js files. So we need to use a different set of rules for client-side JavaScript versus server-side Node.js. And again, I don't remember off the top of my head what that syntax is, so I'll do npm docs eslint config reverend geek, which is my personal take on ESLint rules. And this is the browser environment for ES module support. So we got that in there. So now if we resave here, we get our syntax formatting and all that stuff like we want. And let's refactor the index.html. So instead of these things, we'll say source is client.js, and let's see, we have to specify the type is module, because we're going to use ES modules here instead. Somewhere down the road, we may want to refactor this to use just regular JavaScript. We'll use something like a transpiler or maybe Webpack or some alternative to Webpack to do the transpilation. But for now, we're just going to be blissfully assume that whoever's using this app right now is using a modern browser that supports modules. So any new version of Chrome, Brave, Edge, any of the Safari, any of those browsers, as long as they're fairly recent, they're going to support the ES module syntax. And so now if we run our dev server and let's clear the console and refresh. So I did not choose wisely on socket.io ESM. So what is the name? Let's look under node modules. Socket.io, client distribution. Socket.io. Where did my code go? Socket.io is the right path. Socket.io. ESM.min. Refresh. Hey, client. And if we look at the source code for the page, we just have the one script type equals module for client JS. So now we're set up to, be able to do all our game logic in a separate JavaScript file and not have it in our HTML, which is great. And somewhere down the road, like I mentioned at the beginning of the stream, we may want to use a front end framework, maybe like Vue, which is my personal favorite right now, or we could use something else. I don't know. We'll cross that bridge when we get there. There's also CSS frameworks you may want to use. I'm kind of a fan of Tailwind right now, so we may go down that path. But join me again on the next All Hands on Tech. I hope you got some stuff out of today's. There's a lot of refactoring and fixing some things that we were going down the wrong path from last week. If you got some value out of today's stream, let me know. Leave me a comment, send me a message. If you want to contact me, I am Reverent Geek on all the things. The source code is all a hot trivia game on my repository. And just so that you can see how I do it, we're going to first clear, get status. Here's all the stuff that we did today. Added some stuff. Let's say git add everything. And there's all our modified and new files. And git commit updates to server and client starter. And I'll push that to the repository. So now, if you want to take everything I've done so far and play around with it, use it to, have, if you want to do some of your own homework and send messages back and forth between the server and the client, feel free to do so. And I'd love to hear your feedback. If there's anything else you want to chat about, you can send messages or add issues on that GitHub repository. You can send me messages, david@reverentgeek.com. I'm Reverent Geek on Twitter, and of course David Neal on LinkedIn. And I hope to see you again on the next All Hands on Tech. Currently 2 p.m. Eastern every Thursday. And hope you have a great rest of your week, and see you again.